Sudden, I got jolted, just bolted out of bed.
The Northridge Meadows Apartments was the hardest hit, with the most fatalities after the quake. Mike Kubasi remembers that day vividly, having personally rescued 5 residents before emergency crews arrived.
At one point, I had crawled into a space thinking this is the first floor. Came across one of the casualties, and there's nothing I can do.
It was a day the Southland would never forget. 57 died, 7,000 more were injured, and 40,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed.
Every single one of these units has collapsed. Every single one of these units that was a 3-story is now a 2-story. The fire crews have a tremendous job on their hands right now. They're going from one unit to the next, and as I say, digging holes in the bottom level, and just trying, at this point, trying to find those people who are believed to still be alive.
It was only on the secondary damage survey when they came back around that people were exclaiming, there's people trapped in there.
Larry Collins was a part of a county and city fire department team to survey and assess the quake's damage.
They got out of the fire truck and went down there and looked and physically saw, oh, we have a collapsed first floor. We're actually looking at the second floor on the ground here.
I didn't know we were on the first, because I felt it fall, but I wasn't sure that we were on the first floor because we live on the second floor, and we climbed out the balcony.
On the 9500 block of Reseda Boulevard, 16 people lost their lives.
We have heard tragic stories.
The worst loss of life in any building during the quake.
And that became a major rescue operation where dozens of lives were saved over a period of hours.
The whole house was a bomb went off. Everything in the house was on the floor and broken. There were no windows. All the windows had burst. And I could see outside, and our cinder block wall was gone.
Michael Evans lived on Winnetka Avenue, just 2 miles south of the Northridge Mall that was damaged in the Northridge Quake.
We were lucky in our neighborhood. We were real lucky. With all the damage that was done, it was very fortunate that no one was killed in our area. Several blocks away, people were killed.
And my wife just screaming, "Get the baby, get the baby."
Red Cross volunteer Craig Renetsky had to move into his parents' house with his family for a year before his house was livable again.
I just worked until they were able to bring in a lot of help from outside of California. And then I went back to try to start reconstructing my house and to deal with our own personal disaster.
We're on Balboa Boulevard, just north of the 118 freeway, and yet another bizarre sight here in the aftermath of this earthquake.
Orange County Bureau reporter Michelle Gili recalls later being in one of the most dangerous live shots of her career.
It really did look like a war zone. We had homes burning on both sides of where I was standing. I'm in a couple of feet of water. Balboa Boulevard, you can't even see the street. It's a huge lake with a big fireball coming out from this lake. And then there's a truck in the middle of it all, burned out. That's because the driver had tried to pass through in the middle of all this chaos, and his truck blew up.
Okay, I just want to give you an idea how deep it is. I've got some boots on that go up to my knees, and it's like a bubbling well. Oh, okay, right here, right beneath my feet, there is nothing here. I don't know how deep this is.
At one point, I do recall moving my foot, and I couldn't really feel much beneath me. And it wasn't until later when I saw how big that sinkhole was. You could have fit several cars in it, and that is right where I was standing, going live for several hours. The asphalt had given way, but of course, I couldn't see it.
I remember driving at some point up north to where the 118 freeway was and saw fire coming out of a gas main. And you could see clearly that some buildings were completely destroyed and others no damage at all next to them. A lot of people were scared.
This is where all of those commuters would rather be, the fast lane of the Santa Monica Freeway. But instead, the fast lane stopped dead.
Reporter David Goldstein recalls trying to get to the station after the quake.
I lived in Marina del Rey, and the way to come in was to hop on the Santa Monica Freeway, and it had collapsed. Part of the freeway had collapsed. We'd call the station and have a live truck come out to meet us. And we were stationed there for hours doing live shots around the freeway where it had collapsed in one chunk.
We slept in the car for the first couple of nights. We were afraid to go back in the house and sleep in the house.
Wayne and Raquel Mejia of Agua Dulce lived in Mission Hills at that time.
After a few days, I thought it was time to go home to Sacramento. And I remember flying back home, and I hated leaving my husband alone, but I just was so fearful. And I was in so much shock that I had to leave.
People lost their jobs, people lost their homes, people lost their lives. I think it changed everything. I mean, people started keeping earthquake kits at home. I know it changed the codes and the regulations in Los Angeles on buildings and building codes and safeties. It was really a wake-up call for everybody, which I think we've forgotten now 20 years later. Because there are a number of buildings that still haven't been up to code on for earthquakes.
Safe to say that for anyone who was here 20 years ago today, it is a day that's, well, impossible to forget. The Northridge earthquake. Millions of people jolted awake at 4:31 in the morning. The 6.7 earthquake collapsed freeway overpasses, leveled buildings, and killed several dozen people. Well, today, people came together to remember and to pray. First responders and others sharing their memories, standing in a circle to honor the 57 people who died. NBC4's Gordon Tokamatsu was one of the first reporters to get out to the Northridge Meadows apartment complex. That was the scene of the largest loss of life that day. And he's back there now, today, 20 years later. Gordon?
Well, Chuck, one of my most vivid memories of that morning 20 years ago is how these light poles located here along Reseda Boulevard would shimmy and sway every time there was a major aftershock. It made us very nervous out here on the street, as you can imagine. But today we spoke with a man who was actually inside one of those collapsed buildings when those aftershocks would rumble through this neighborhood.
I think that we're in a much better position.
Scott Gould was an LA City firefighter paramedic 20 years ago, waved down by frantic residents along Reseda Boulevard. They directed him to Northridge Meadows apartment building, which appeared to be a two-story structure. But then his captain shocked everyone with this statement.
This is a 3-story apartment building. We've lost a floor.
The force of the 6.7 quake had pancaked the top floors into the bottom. The rescue and recovery kicked into high gear. Gould says a woman screamed, "My baby is in there," as he cut a hole in the floor.
Excuse me, how old's your baby? And she said 14 years old. And that was the first fatality that we had.
Gould personally pulled 3 of the 16 dead from the building that morning. This location would become a national symbol for the quake's devastating impact on Los Angeles.
It hit you hard.
This morning at exactly 4:31 a.m., a moment of silence marked 20 years since the disaster. Linked hands, candles, and silent prayers for the Northridge Meadows 16 and 41 others citywide.
I was 22.
City leaders present, like Councilman Mitch Englander, gathered at Cal State Northridge campus for a morning of remembrances.
What were you thinking when you watched that? We've got to do something. And, I certainly didn't think it then. I didn't. I was young.
But leaders past, like former Mayor Richard Reardon, certainly did. He recalled how Angelenos helped each other.
People were helping get people saved from the Northridge Meadows.
Today, a new apartment complex has taken the destroyed one's place. A symbol, say witnesses to the quake, the city's legendary ability to bounce back. And back here live, where you can see a picture of that apartment complex today, it occurred to me as I was standing here on the street corner today that so much time has passed that some of the folks who actually live in this apartment complex now, they not even have been born when this terrible tragedy happened 20 years ago. Reporting live from Northridge, Gordon Tokamatsu, NBC4 News.
Where were you when the ground shook 20 years ago today? On January 17th, 1994, the Northridge earthquake was the costliest disaster in U.S. history, a record that stood until Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast in 2005.
As you can see, it's completely collapsed.
20 years ago today, Southern California was rocked by a 6.7 magnitude earthquake centered in Northridge. The 4:31 a.m. tremor lasted only 7 seconds, but those few moments have impacted an entire generation of Angelenos.
It actually lifted up our house and it moved left to right.
Well, I was worried it was going to be the big one.
Hundreds of thousands were violently awakened to chaos in their homes. Outside, a catastrophe. The quake caused gas lines to rupture near the epicenter, igniting fires in the early morning darkness. KTLA was among the first on air to report on the quake.
we're just probably discovering some of the damages in our home. Try to just maintain your composure.
7 major freeway bridges in the area collapsed, and another 200 plus were damaged, jamming up traffic across Ventura and Los Angeles for weeks. Entire buildings collapsed, including the Northridge Meadows apartment complex, where 16 people were killed, all of them on the first floor. The total human cost, more than 60 people lost their lives and over 9,000 were injured. In dollars, $49 billion in damage to property and economic loss.
It was located directly under the West Valley. And so we had 500,000 people literally on top of the earthquake.
Scientists continue to warn that the Northridge quake is only a prelude to the big one.
It's going to happen again. That's a size of earthquake that happens every few decades in the Los Angeles area. We're going to have it again.
Right.
Before Northridge, most of California's earthquake worries were focused on the San Andreas Fault. Since then, we've learned that Southern California is riddled with many other faults capable of producing large earthquakes. Be ready.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we see the commercials and, they tell you what to get, and it's just important to be earthquake ready. We know where we're going to be. We will be right here, but that's definitely important.
We have no idea where we'll be.
We'll be here soon enough, though. That's for sure. Yeah.
It was really interesting. Story tweeted me earlier today, just sort of a Twitter follower. Anyway, he said, what was the weather like when the earthquake happened? And I checked, and sure enough, it was 84 degrees. Today, it was 85. And that month, in January, the year of the earthquake, they had like little to no rain the entire month. So it was just so interesting. But remember, guys, there's no such thing as earthquake weather, which is how this whole conversation began.
20 years ago today, at exactly 4:31 a.m., the earth started shaking. And when it was over, people from every corner of the Southland, rich, poor, young, old, every race, in every neighborhood, had one thing in common. We all remember where we were when the Northridge earthquake hit.
It was a nightmare. We were jolted out of bed.
I just could not believe how much the house shook.
Scott and Eileen Kramer say because their home at the time backed up to the hills in Northridge, they could hear sound waves from the aftershocks rumbling through like a freight train.
The house would start to shake and it would pass. And a few minutes later, we'd hear the rumbling start. And again, we could hear it before we felt it. And it was really a bizarre feeling, knowing that there was an earthquake coming.
Candida Gonim and her husband woke up in the pitch darkness.
We finally got out of bed. We had our kids across the other side of the house, across the hall. Everything on the bookcase fell. And my husband had to walk on all fours because the house was moving so badly.
If you were here in Southern California on January 17th, 1994, chances are you have a story to tell. The shaking lasted only about 10 seconds, but it was brutally violent. People felt the 6.7 magnitude earthquake as far away as Las Vegas. People in Idaho suffered power outages. 57 people were killed.
You're watching an Eyewitness News special report. The Northridge Quake.
It was especially challenging for those of us who were reporting the news, like photographer Stephen Coleman, who lived in Granada Hills and who suffered a lot of damage. My home was undamaged, but many of my colleagues, like former sports anchor Todd Donahoe, lived near the epicenter and had to contend with major damage to their homes and neighborhoods.
Here's what's left over of our china and crystal collection, wedding presents from 15 years ago.
For those of us who did make it in, trying to convey the sheer magnitude and scope of the disaster was overwhelming. This was the biggest news story most of us had ever covered.
This was a 3-story building. The second story is now sitting on top of the first story.
My first assignment was the Santa Monica Freeway in West LA, where 2 overpasses collapsed. People living in nearby apartments were understandably rattled.
The most scariest thing about it was when I saw this car, I realized that it could have flew off anywhere along this line and flew right into my house.
Some 100 buildings in Santa Monica were red tagged, unusual considering how far it was from the quake's epicenter. I found a lot of devastation there, including this landmark structure on Santa Monica Boulevard. This is the Santa Monica Masonic Temple. The building has stood here since 1923. They spent about $250,000 very recently to make it earthquake safe. The renovations helped to keep the building up, most of it. but it will have to be condemned.
It's really sad to see a fine building like this go.
The time of death is duly noted on a wall clock frozen at the moment the temblor hit. 20 years later, there's a new clock on the wall, and of course the building is still here, not condemned as I had reported back then. They were able to save it at considerable cost, and they were able to make it earthquake safe. The repairs and retrofitting cost $2 million and took about a year and a half.
So it's been a win-win situation out of what could have been, we think, was a tragedy, but it's worked out quite well.
Like the rest of the Southland, recovery was costly. Physical scars are mostly gone. The memories for so many of us won't fade so easily. One family we spoke to says the Northridge Quake set off their burglar alarm, and to this day they're reluctant to set it because if it goes off accidentally, it triggers very troubling memories. Experts say these memories should trigger us all to prepare because the big one could come at any time, and it will be much bigger, much more destructive than the Northridge Quake.
20 years ago, on this date, the ground shook early in the morning and changed Southern California forever. The 1994 Northridge earthquake measured 6.7, started shaking at 4:31 in the morning. Lasted only 10, maybe 20 seconds, yet destroyed or damaged 9,000 buildings. 57 people were killed, 16 of them at the Northridge Meadows apartments, which collapsed into its own underground parking garage.
It was complete chaos and disaster beyond anyone's imagination. There was debris everywhere and people were in shock.
Sure enough, I see the guy's feet moving underneath some debris. So get back out there, see the boulevard, get some of the fire department guys. Next thing you know, we're using airbags, cribbings, trying to raise this building, and sure enough, there's still a live survivor in there, and once we get him out, it turns out his roommate was still alive also.
The amount of damage done was historic. $49 billion, the most expensive natural disaster in the United States until Hurricane Katrina. The quake forced changes in emergency preparedness and building codes throughout our state.
Those of us who lived through that quake all have distinct and personal memories of that day, but there's one person more than anyone else perhaps who captured the tragedy in a way that no one else could. Wishuman introduces us to him.
My agency paged me right away, and they had heard that there was a street worker buried under the parking structure at the Northridge Mall.
That was the beginning of a long day photojournalist David Honnell will never forget.
So I drove up there as soon as I could, photographed the rescue efforts of that until they airlifted him out of there. And then page after page I was getting news of the Northridge Meadows apartment.
This was the guy that was trapped?
He was trapped.
The challenge for him, much like a first responder, trying to divorce emotion from his job. Easier said than done.
I'm always looking for a really great picture. When you've got devastation in front of you, you still feel those emotions. You feel for a man on a stretcher, or you feel for, a family that's lost their home. But the ultimate reward for that is if you get a good picture and it's published, it tells that person's story.
Here's People magazine, one of a number of publications around the world that used Honnell's photos.
Later, when I saw a 2-page spread of mine in People, which I was shooting for that day, then I knew that I had something. Until then, I wasn't really comfortable with having award-winning pictures from the day. It was mostly just to get it on film.
Now and then, the site of the Northridge Meadows collapse, where 16 people died, has been rebuilt. A new apartment building is there now. The Northridge Fashion Center has a new parking garage, replacing the one that collapsed. Robinson's May, now Macy's. And a new restaurant sits where the building that once housed a store in the now defunct Warehouse Music chain stood. So yes, the physical damage has long since been repaired. But 20 years later, the memories are still vivid.
Every time I drive into a parking structure, I think about that day when they rescued the man from under that rubble. But here, Los Angeles, from my opinion, wasn't prepared at all for it structurally. Today, I think we are. I think that's what was learned from that earthquake.
One thing Honnell was actually worried about that day was whether he'd have enough gas to keep driving around. Remember, if the electricity's out, the gas pumps don't work. Something for all of us to keep in mind. Phil Schumann, Fox 11 News.